The conference room fell into a heavy silence as Madison Clark, the sharp and polished chief executive officer of a billion-dollar tech conglomerate, slid 5 glossy photographs across the table toward her 10-year-old daughter. "Sweetheart," Madison said in a calm, rehearsed voice, "it's time you chose your new father. Pick one of these men. They're all powerful, wealthy, and capable of giving you the life you deserve." Executives lining the long oak table exchanged subtle smirks, some amused, others indifferent. All but the little girl. Grace didn't even blink. Her green eyes swept over the photos, faces of bankers, moguls, and senators. But then her gaze shifted. At the far end of the room, near a corner where the sunlight barely reached, stood a man with a mop in hand. He was the only one who had offered her a smile when no one else even noticed her presence. She lifted her chin and pointed. "I choose Elijah," she said clearly. A wave of stunned gasps rolled through the room like a tremor before an earthquake. The janitor froze mid-swipe, his calloused hands gripping the mop like it was the only thing holding him to the earth. Madison blinked, once. Then again. "Gracie, darling," she said through a tight smile that didn't touch her eyes, "I think you misunderstood. These men," she gestured toward the photos, "they run empires. They dine with presidents. Elijah, well, he cleans floors." Grace turned to face her mother, voice firm. "But Elijah already gave me what I needed." Every head turned toward the janitor, who now looked like a man on the edge of either bolting or being bolted down. Elijah Brooks stood frozen in place, the mop dripping silently at his feet. He had been working at the company barely 6 months, a quiet presence, never asking for anything. Madison's expression turned ice cold. "He scrubs tile. That's not a future, Grace." "He's the only one who talks to me," Grace replied. "He listens. That's the future I want." Murmurs swelled around the table. Elijah looked like he wanted to disappear into the walls. But instead, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but low, "your daughter doesn't need a billionaire. She needs someone who sees her." Madison's stilettos echoed like gunshots as she walked toward him, her movements sharp and deliberate. Her voice, when it came, was smooth as silk but sharp as a dagger. "You've just embarrassed me in front of my board, my partners, and my child," she said through gritted teeth. "I didn't say anything untrue," Elijah replied, jaw tight. "She made the choice." Grace clutched his hand like it was the only safe thing in the world. Her eyes darted between her mother and Elijah, not with fear, but defiance. Madison turned back to her daughter, laughing bitterly. "You think this man can protect you? Provide for you? He can't even afford a decent shirt." Elijah's uniform was faded. His work boots were scuffed. The knees of his pants were worn thin. But his eyes were unwavering when he said, "I may not have money, but I've got integrity. And I won't let anyone treat her like a contract." Madison let out a cold laugh. "Integrity doesn't pay for private school. It doesn't silence the media. It doesn't keep you safe. It does keep you from feeling invisible," Grace said suddenly. Her voice echoed through the high ceilings. "Mom, you're surrounded by people every day. And you're still alone." The words landed like a slap. No one moved. No one breathed. Elijah stepped back slightly, meeting Madison's gaze. "I'm not trying to take your place," he said. "But maybe ask yourself why your daughter picked the janitor over any man in your world." For the first time, Madison had no quick response. Her lips parted, but no words came. Elijah knew he should leave, walk out the door and disappear from this polished, curated world. But Grace's small hand clutched his tighter. If he walked away now, he'd be abandoning the only real connection this child had in her life. And that was something he just couldn't do. The heavy doors of the boardroom slammed shut behind them, but the sound seemed to follow Elijah like a ghostly echo that refused to die. As he walked down the corridor, he could still feel the invisible burn of Madison Clark's stare drilling into the back of his neck. Grace hadn't let go of his hand since they'd stepped away from that long, gleaming conference table. Her grip, small but fierce, was anchored in something much deeper than fear. "You're not leaving, right?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than a breath. Too quiet for a girl who just challenged a room full of corporate titans. Elijah knelt down to meet her eyes. But before he could say a word, Grace cut him off. "You're not like her," she said. "I don't care what she thinks. I don't care about suits or cars or money. You're my friend. You talk to me. You listen. You saved my puppy when the elevator doors nearly crushed her, remember?" He remembered that day. It had been instinct, nothing heroic in his mind. The little dog had darted forward just as the elevator was closing, and he had lunged, snatching her by the leash and yanking her back to safety. No one had clapped. No one had thanked him. Just Grace's soft smile, one that had stuck with him for weeks. "Real friends don't leave," she whispered. Elijah swallowed hard. "I'm not going anywhere unless someone makes me." That didn't take long. They had barely reached the lobby when a man in a tailored black suit stepped in front of them. He was broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and eyes like polished stone, clearly head of security. "Mr. Brooks," the man said curtly, "your employment has been terminated effective immediately." Elijah clenched his jaw. "Of course," he muttered, glancing down at Grace. Her little fingers gripped tighter. Madison descended the staircase with the poise of a woman who owned every room she entered. Her heels clicked like gunfire across the marble tiles. Her voice rang out effortlessly. "Gracie, go upstairs with Mrs. Devlin," she said with faux warmth. "We'll talk about this later." "No," Grace replied flatly without hesitation. Madison's eyes narrowed. "Don't test me." Elijah could have stepped back. He could have let the guards escort him out quietly and walked away from the chaos. But something inside him refused to let Grace face it alone. "She's not a contract," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's not a pawn to be bartered in boardroom deals. She's a child. And she's choosing who to trust." Madison's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you've won something here, Mr. Brooks? You've painted a target on your back. I'll make sure you never find another job in this city again." Elijah held her gaze without blinking. "If standing by her costs me everything, then so be it." The air felt heavier. The space between them crackled with something unspoken and volatile. Madison's nostrils flared, but she didn't answer. She pivoted sharply, heels echoing, and strode out of the lobby. The guard stepped forward to remove Elijah by force, but before he could raise a hand, Grace moved. "If he leaves, then so do I," she said, stepping between them. The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "You really want tomorrow's headlines to read, 'Seo throws out her own daughter for hugging the janitor'?" Elijah asked quietly, never breaking eye contact with the guard. The man's jaw tightened, but eventually, he stepped aside. Elijah didn't move. He looked down at Grace, whose face was a storm of fear and fierce resolve. And in that moment he understood, this was far from over. Madison Clark wasn't the kind of woman who took public embarrassment lightly. By the next morning his phone was ringing nonstop. But none of the calls were from job recruiters. There were 3 voicemails, all from companies where he'd applied just days earlier. Each was polite, professional, and carried the same thinly veiled message: "We've decided to pursue other candidates." He got one email from the building's human resources team, reminding him, per contract, that his locker needed to be cleared out by 5 p.m. And then there was a text from an unknown number. Just one line: "Should have stayed invisible, janitor." He didn't need a detective to figure out who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Still, when Elijah showed up at the little coffee shop near City Park, he wasn't thinking about his career or the threats. He was thinking about Grace. Because yesterday, just before security had escorted him out, she had slipped him a small folded note. It said only, "Meet me here." When he pushed through the glass doors of the cafe, the morning rush was just beginning. The scent of roasted beans filled the air, and soft jazz trickled through the speakers. And there she was. Grace sat on a stool way too big for her, her legs swinging back and forth, 2 steaming paper cups sitting on the table in front of her like a peace offering. "You showed up," she said, relief flooding her expression. "I said I would, didn't I?" Elijah replied, trying to smile despite the ache behind his eyes. "One of these is hot chocolate," she said, sliding a cup toward him. The other is just black coffee. I wasn't sure which one you liked. He picked up the black coffee, took a sip, and nodded. Good call. She grinned, sipping her hot chocolate with both hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only warmth in the world. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace asked, "Did she fire you because of me?" Elijah shook his head slowly. "She fired me because I didn't stay in my place. Because I didn't walk away." "But you could have," Grace said quietly. "Yeah," he admitted. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her, really looked. At this little girl with too much loneliness in her eyes and too much weight on her small shoulders. "Because no one else did," he said finally. "And you don't deserve to be left alone again." Grace blinked, and for the first time, her face trembled, not with fear, but with something softer. A kind of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Outside, the city kept moving. People rushing, horns honking, deals being made. But inside that small cafe, for just a few minutes, time stood still. And for the first time in days, Elijah didn't feel like a man who had lost everything. He felt like someone who'd finally done something right. "You got this for me?" Elijah asked with a raised brow. Grace grinned, stirring her drink like it was a science experiment. "It's hot chocolate," she corrected. "You looked like you needed it more than I did." That small gesture hit him harder than anything Madison Clark had thrown his way. No strategy. No strings. Just a kid showing kindness. He let out a soft breath. "Pretty sure your mom wouldn't be thrilled about this." Grace shrugged, never looking up from her cup. "She only gets thrilled when something makes her richer." There was no anger in her tone, just brutal honesty spoken with the clarity only a child could manage. "She doesn't care about people," Grace continued, "but you do. So I'm not going to stop talking to you, no matter what she says." Before Elijah could respond, the doorbell chimed. A man in a sleek navy suit stepped into the cafe, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Elijah. He moved toward them with practiced confidence, his polished shoes barely making a sound. "Mr. Brooks," the man said, voice smooth but tight. "My name is Simon Pierce. I represent Hayes Global." Elijah leaned back in his chair as Simon reached into his jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. "Miss Clark," he continued, placing the envelope gently on the table, "has authorized me to offer you compensation in exchange for stepping quietly out of her daughter's life." Grace's eyes widened in disbelief. Elijah didn't even glance at the envelope. "I'm not interested in her money," he said plainly. "You may want to reconsider," Simon replied, lowering his voice just a touch. "It would be unfortunate if certain stories about your past found their way into the press." Before Elijah could react, Grace slammed her tiny fist on the table, rattling the cups. "You're lying," she snapped, her voice sharp and fearless. "He didn't do anything wrong." Simon's jaw clenched, but his gaze never left Elijah's face. "You have until the end of the day," he said coolly. "After that, I can't guarantee this stays polite." He turned and walked out without waiting for a reply. When the door closed behind him, Grace looked up at Elijah with eyes full of equal parts worry and stubbornness. "She's gonna try to ruin you." Elijah nodded slowly. "Yeah," he sighed. "But she only wins if I walk away from you. And I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in what felt like days, Grace smiled. "Good. Because I have a plan." 2 days later, the grand ballroom at the Hayes Global Charity Gala shimmered beneath 1,000 lights. Cameras flashed nonstop as photographers elbowed for space near the velvet ropes. It was the company's most glamorous night of the year, Madison Clark's personal stage to flaunt her empire and poise. And right in the middle of it, slipping through a side entrance, came Grace, with Elijah at her side. This time, they looked different. He wore a dark blazer and clean dress shirt, and she was radiant in a pale blue dress that shimmered in the lights. It had been her idea, her strategy, a moment when her mother couldn't lash out without damaging her precious image. Elijah had hesitated. The thought of dragging Grace deeper into Madison's manipulative world made him sick. But one look at her determined little face reminded him why he had stayed in the first place. As they walked in, the room quieted. Whispers rippled across the floor. Some guests recognized Elijah. After all, the photo of Grace hugging the janitor in the boardroom had gone viral. Though Madison's PR team labeled it a misunderstanding, the public had responded with more fascination than outrage. From the stage, Madison spotted them halfway through her speech. Her voice didn't break, but her grip on the podium visibly tightened. "And tonight," she said smoothly, "is about the future, building strong alliances for the next generation." That's when Grace stepped forward. Her voice was soft but crystal clear. "Then maybe the future should start with the truth." The crowd hushed. "Mom," Grace continued, "you told everyone I'd pick one of your friends to be my new dad. But I already made my choice. I picked Elijah because he's the only person in that building who treats me like I matter, and not like some prize to show off." Silence blanketed the room like fresh snow. Elijah could feel every pair of eyes shift toward him, but his focus never left Grace. She stood straight, steady, facing down the most powerful woman in the room, and her own mother. Madison chuckled softly, trying to collect herself. "She's just a child," she began. "You're just scared," Grace cut in. "Scared that people will find out you can't buy love." A ripple of gasps and quiet laughter stirred through the guests. A few reporters began typing faster. Some guests exchanged amused glances. Madison Clark's bulletproof image had just cracked, and it wasn't from a business rival or legal scandal. It was her daughter's words that did it. Elijah stepped up beside Grace. His voice was calm, steady, the voice of a man with nothing left to hide. "I didn't come here to take anything from you, Miss Clark," he said. "But if standing by your daughter makes me the enemy, then I'll gladly wear that label." A few claps broke out from the back of the room. Then more. One table, then another. Within moments, half the ballroom was applauding. Phones were recording. No one was looking at Madison anymore. She stood frozen, her teeth clenched behind a brittle smile. She couldn't have them thrown out, not without turning the entire city against her. Later, when the lights dimmed and the event faded into quiet, Grace leaned in close to Elijah and whispered, "Told you my plan would work." He grinned. "You were right, kiddo." And as they walked out together, past the cameras, past the curious stares and murmured headlines, Elijah knew something had shifted. Whatever war Madison tried to wage after this, Grace had just won them the first battle. Tap like if you believe loyalty is stronger than power. Drop a comment, subscribe now to follow the developments. The real storm is yet to come.